Have you ever noticed how many dense literary novels are also really, really long? So you're working your way through it, you're liking some things, you're not putting other pieces together. And then there's always that moment when you turn it around and look at the spine and say, Dear God, I've got another 600 pages of this. What I want to do today is look at some books that have that same sort of flavor, but maybe aren't quite so long. Books that clock in at about the 200 page range. One of my favorites is Cosmos by Witold Gombrowicz. This book is about two students that are traveling to a remote hotel because they want to study for their law exams. And along the way, they find something that they can't explain. It's a bird that for some reason has been hung by its neck from a tree. And this single event is so shaking to them that they sort of drive themselves crazy through the rest of the book, trying to figure out if it's truly just an isolated event or if it's somehow part of a larger plan. And their paranoia grows through the book as they start to see signs almost everywhere they look that may connect or may not. And really what I think this book is about language itself. And the way that we try to name things is a way of controlling them. There's a scene towards the end of the book where one of the people from the hotel and the student, the main character in the book, have this conversation about whether names matter at all. I sat on a tree stump a little distance away. His bald head formed with his pince-nez a glassy dome-like hole. And I asked him whether he knew the names of the mountains. He didn't know. I asked him the name of the valley. He muttered back that he knew once but had forgotten. What are these mountains to you? They're names. This is not a matter of names. And I was about to ask, then what is it about? But I held back. Those sort of conversations happen throughout this book. It's not a book that has a lot of closure at the end, although it does have a nice ending. And it clocks in right at about the 200-page mark. It's a book that I've thought about a lot since I finished it. Another book that I liked that's a little bit on the shorter side is Malloy by Samuel Beckett. Now, I know this looks like a really thick version. It's not. There's 3 books in there. Malloy actually clocks in at about 170 pages. And the topic of this book, it has 2 parallel narratives. One about Malloy, who's an old man who's probably telling the story of how he traveled back to his mother's house to die. And in the second half, an agent named Moran tells the story of how he was summoned by his bosses to go look for this Malloy character, who he's supposed to do something with once he finds him, although he's not really sure where Malloy exists. And there's a lot of ways to read this. Moran might be the only character. Malloy is sort of a fiction that he creates. You can read it a little bit more literally. But what this book is really about is about our own search for order, and especially about our search for some sort of closure in our lives as we get closer and closer to death. But I also tried to remember what I was to do with Malloy once I had found him, and on myself too I poured, and on me so changed from what I was. And I seemed to see myself aging as swiftly as a dayfly. But the idea of aging was not exactly the one which offered itself to me. And what I saw was more like a crumbling, a frenzied collapsing of all that had always protected me from all I was always condemned to be. Or it was like a kind of clawing towards a light and a countenance I could not name that I had once known and long denied. Now, if you asked me to read 1,200 pages of that, it might get kind of tough, but for 170 pages, I found this to be a really moving meditation on identity, death, and the search for meaning in the world, the journey that we all go on. Crying a Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, 160 pages. I personally think this is a great place to start with Thomas Pynchon. I shot another video about that. But this book is accessible not because the writing is super easy. Thomas Pynchon sort of launches into things. He really trusts the readers to follow the story along. So instead of stopping the flow to say, oh, this person is going to think about this now. Or, hey, we entered the room and these 5 people were in it. He kind of lets the action happen, and you have to be reading closely in order to follow it. For instance, on the very first page, one summer afternoon, Mrs. Oedipa Mass comes home from a Tupperware party, whose hostess had put perhaps too much kirsch in the fondue to find out that she, Oedipa, had been named executor, or she supposed executrix, of the estate of one Pierce Inverarity, a California real estate mogul who had once lost $2 million in his spare time, but still had assets numerous and tangled enough to make the job of sorting it all out more than honorary. Oedipus stood in the living room, stared at by the greenish dead eye of the TV tube, spoke the name of God, tried to feel as drunk as possible, but this did not work. She thought of a hotel room in Mazatlan, whose door had just been slammed, it seemed forever, waking up 200 birds down in the lobby. A sunrise over the library slope at Cornell University that nobody out on it had seen because the slope faces west. A dry, disconsolate tune from the fourth movement of the Bartok Concerto for Orchestra, a whitewashed bust of Jay Gould that Pierce kept over the bed on a shelf so narrow for it, she'd always had the hovering fear it would someday topple on them. Like, that is a lot of detail. It is a lot of memories and a lot of characters, a lot of paranoia, a lot of jokes, all crammed into the very first paragraph, first couple of sentences of this book. Now, you probably know, I love Thomas Pynchon. I've read all of his books. That sort of writing style, it is a endurance effort to get through it if you're reading something like Against the Day. But Crying a Lot 49, you read it, you learn a lot about it, you get a lot of jokes. It's a lot of fun to get through. And it's just not that long. And last, I'm going to recommend A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. Now, Clockwork Orange, there's a famous movie based on it. I'm not sure everyone realizes there was a book. And what makes the book interesting is the fact that Burgess sort of creates his own language for these characters, these people running around and committing these crimes around their city. It was a little bit hard to find a passage to read from this that was appropriate because this is a book about crime. It's a book about awful people and sort of insane people. But this will give you a flavor of what I'm talking about. I don't think it's possible for me to mispronounce these words because I don't think most of them actually exist. We yekated back townwards, my brothers, but just outside, not far from what they called the industrial canal, we viddied the fuel needle had like collapsed like our own ha needles had, and the auto was coughing, cashel, cashel, cashel. Not to worry over much, though, because a rail station kept flashing blue, on, off, just near. The point was whether to leave the audio to be so bureaucrated by the Rozes or us feeling like in a hate and murder mood to give it a fair tall chuck into the starry waters for a nice heavy loud plesk before the death of the evening. It's not hard to understand, but it's something that you've got to pay attention to. It's a lot of fun learning this other language and getting into the world and the minds of these people through the language that they create. So there's 4 books. They have great stuff in them, a lot to learn from them, but none of them crack that 200-page mark. And so you can get through them in a week and feel like, hey, not only do I enjoy that, it didn't suck up 3 months of my life.